When I had finished playing Stories Untold, I was left digesting a number of different thoughts, such as how well crafted of a game it was, how much I love that retro 80s aesthetic, how each episode unfolded without any real sense of contrivance, it all felt really natural, and how it stood out as a pretty great horror game in and of itself. But then there were also thoughts surrounding its themes. It's no accident that I found that retro 80s aesthetic appealing, because the game was specifically designed to use it as a selling point. Scenes are doused in thick layers of film grain. Old technology like CRT TVs, VCRs, and cassette players are prominently put on display. The entirety of the game's first episode, The House Abandoned, is set up to emulate what it's like to play a game on what is clearly an analog for an old ZX Spectrum computer. Episodes 2, The Lab Conduit, and 3, The Station Process, ask the player to interact with equipment that looks and sounds like it's 30 years out of date, which is precisely what it is. The game features a soundtrack that is entirely comprised of synth tunes, right out of the 80s, and its cover art is designed by Kyle Lambert, the same artist who made the posters for Stranger Things, Super 8, and a bunch of other stuff that feels reminiscent of the very era that Stories Untold tries to bring the player back to. It's evocative and eye-catching, not to mention currently in vogue. It's a game that banks on reminiscence as a central thematic hook, before proceeding to deconstruct those feelings over the course of its run. Much of this has to do with precisely how Stories Untold is constructed. It's an adventure horror game that is made up of a compilation of 4 distinct episodes. Individually, they're short, bite-sized stories that comprise a number of different genres. Predominantly featured is the classical text adventure game, a la Zork and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But it also bears elements that resemble other kind of adventure games too, such as puzzle adventure and escape the room games. All of these elements come together to punctuate the game's central pillar, a callback to the past. In fact, it's such a powerful statement that it resonates even with people who don't have first-hand memories of the very things that the game is trying to evoke. I'm willing to wager that anybody who played this game and has never touched a ZX Spectrum computer in their lives before would still feel some connection to the motifs that the game is trying to present. And that connection is necessary because Stories Untold's use of long-dead idiosyncrasies is required to dismantle those nostalgic principles. Why else would the game build itself upon a genre that is, for all intents and purposes, dead? Why use counterintuitive gameplay mechanics that involves uncomfortably shifting between 2 in-game monitors to read instructions on how to proceed? Why include puzzle keys on an object that requires slow and plodding manual transitions to flip through? It's all there to make you feel like what games felt like back then, whether or not you were already familiar with it. In what Ed Smith called an expression of anti-nostalgia in his article about Stories Untold, and I'll put a link to that in the description below the video, Stories Untold turns its attention to the warm, fuzzy memories that reflect on the happier times in our past, and turns that notion on its head. It presents nostalgia as something that can be easily manipulated in order to hide from the harsh truth that reality provides, often presenting memories that are sugar-coated and devoid of what would otherwise resemble any sort of negative accompaniment. That's the part of the game that its mechanics are looking to exploit. We often think about the happy feelings associated with playing games along the lines of the ones presented by Stories Untold. We manage to overcome the negative aspects about it, often forgiving the areas of the game that are lacking because it's the overall experience that we cherish. It's a motif of gaming itself. It's why games like Planescape Torment or Silent Hill are so beloved, or even other adventure games like Zork with their impossible text parsers at times. It's not because they're constructed to stand the test of time mechanically, but rather because the overall sum of their parts is what we take away from our experiences in interacting with it. We forget about the lousy combat or awkward tank controls, just like we forget about the negative connotations that are associated with those memories of gaming back in the day. The monotony of going to school, or doing our chores, or doing homework, or anything else of that period that our lives were host to. As a piece of experimental fiction, I think Stories Untold is brilliant. It masterfully manages to tell a psychological horror story while creating an immersive experience by marrying player input with narrative output. It actually reminds me a lot of Her Story, in the sense that its emphasis is placed on delivering a cohesive story that's told through its mechanics. So much so, in fact, that, like Her Story, any attempt to remove either of those elements from one another ultimately ruins the entire experience. So on that notion alone, I would highly recommend Stories Untold to anyone, especially if you're looking for a title that will stimulate your imagination rather than to outright scare you at every turn. And it's a feeling that lasts right up until the curtain is lifted in Episode 4, the last session, and the game's big secret is revealed to you. And it's through that revelation that the game's narrative theme, that disavowal of nostalgia and its tendency to block out certain portions of reality, really starts to take shape. At first glance, each of the game's 4 main episodes looks to be entirely isolated from one another, and the first 3 certainly play that way. But it's in episode 4 when the game really comes to a head and reveals that those 3 previous episodes are actually strands in a much deeper story. It's here where you learn that the game's protagonist, James Ashen, was guilty of causing the deaths of both his sister Jennifer and an off-duty police officer following a drunk driving incident. What's worse, the entire reason that his sister is dead is because of him. He intentionally left her to die in the smoldering ruins of his car in order to cover the other driver with the alcohol that he had on hand, thus saving himself from an impending retribution. And while this revelation acts as a means of filling in the gaps left between the game's first episodes that the game, again, wants you to think don't quite fit in with one another, it doesn't do so much as reveal new information as much as confirms pre-existing assumptions. All the hints are right there from the game's beginning. They merely lack context. Stuff like pulling a note out of the glove compartment of a car that keeps saying, "Get out, get out, get out of the car." Code words that call back to the incident, like drive, sibling, Jennifer, and sacrifice. Unintelligible flashbacks to the same evening, unknowing shadows walking in the distance without any clear indication of what they are, and visions of a car accident in the Arctic that comes seemingly out of nowhere, are all there to drip feed the story to the player over a long period of time. Even the protagonist's name, Ashen, comes from the Greek noun Asia or Atia, or however it's pronounced. I don't know how to pronounce Greek words, which is used in more than one biblical book to describe things like fault, cause, or the charging of somebody with a crime. But more than that, they also reveal that the episodes that you play through, and subsequently the episodes that James himself is experiencing, aren't some supernatural happenstance. They're his imagination as he processes his past while he's either in a coma or undergoing therapy sessions after awakening from one. In essence, what James is doing is recalling a time in his life before the accident, one that is heavily influenced by him playing old computer games in his room or by indulging the science fiction television shows that he loves.
I think that's enough of that for now. You're quite fond of this show, aren't you?
In order to escape from the truth of what had happened. Meanwhile, reality is finding a way to break down those barriers and remind him that he, and he alone, is the reason that 2 people are dead. And no amount of running from that fact changes the truth. Think about it this way. The episodes that you play through, the fantasies that go on through James's mind, are the same kind of games of imagination that a child plays. It's the active use of imagination to escape into a world of fantasy and happiness by pretending that they're doing things that they can't otherwise do in real life, such as performing science experiments on alien artifacts or intercepting and decoding radio transmissions. These episodes, the episodes that the player goes through, are all influenced by James's past, a past that's more innocent, less judgmental, and more welcoming to the reality that he finds himself in, a past that's fueled by his nostalgia. Once more, there are even instances where he uses those imaginary episodes to justify his actions. For instance, in the station process, James communicates to 2 other unseen radio operators, and it's later revealed that those voices are actually those of the police officer who arrived at the scene of the accident, and his sister Jennifer. At one point during the episode, Jennifer urges James to leave his cabin to fix the problem that they've encountered, only to later suddenly strangely turn about and start calling him by his first name and start telling him that she can no longer feel her legs, a complete 180 of the situation. It's an analog of him leaving her in the car to die while he left to go fix the problem of the accident that he caused. There are also shades of this when James is experimenting on the human heart in episode 2, only to eventually have it burst, which is supposed to make the player feel guilty for destroying it. But really, he, and so too the player, were only doing what needed to be done in order to progress the story, or in James's case, progress on with his life. Likewise, it's plastered all over episode 4, where no matter what you do, you're forced down a linear path to see a certain outcome unfold before your eyes. It's because you can't change the past, and all it measures up to is a way of trying to avoid that painful truth. It's through this that Stories Untold's use of retro images and themes are used to create a stark contrast between nostalgia being a fond memory of a better time and blissful ignorance of the bigger picture. It casts itself as a game that's interested in reality at the expense of comfort, and that truth is inescapable. Putting up walls to section off that which is uncomfortable offers nothing more than a limited understanding of that bigger picture, and without the other pieces of the story that James himself is hiding from, it's impossible to grasp the bigger picture. It's only when those walls break down and that reality rears its ugly head that the player begins to understand the circumstances surrounding James's personal nightmare. In this sense, nostalgia is an obstacle that prevents the player from reaching that plateau of understanding. It irrevocably shows that retreating into what we think is happiness can be more damaging than facing the truth. It took James 4 sessions with his doctor and as many mental lapses to come to terms with the fact that hiding in the past won't help him. He still has to live with his guilt, and by the end of it all, he only suffered more. And that's ultimately the statement that the game is trying to make. It's not a blanket, nostalgia is bad morality tale, nor is it a PSA against drunk driving per se. It's a game that's interested in creating a horror story based on the fact that nostalgia gives the power to avoid coming to terms with the past. It's the easy way out. And by turning that on its head, it essentially places its value on the unbridled honesty that the truth offers in nostalgia's stead. And it's in that, its brash espousal of the concept that it's the truth that will ultimately set you free, that Stories Untold stakes its claim.